attention to what you are looking at in this footage. This is security camera footage from inside a school classroom, room 14, Alcott Preparatory Academy. The camera is mounted high in the corner of the room, angled downward, the kind of wide-angle institutional camera designed to capture the full space at once, the kind that everyone notices on their first day and completely forgets about by the second week. The timestamp in the lower left corner is running. The room is empty except for 2 people. Look at the figures in the center of the frame. One is an adult male, polo shirt, khakis, the unremarkable professional wardrobe of someone who works in a school. The other is a student, 12, maybe 13 years old. They are standing close together in a way that reads, at first glance, like an entirely routine after-school conversation, a homework question, a concern about tomorrow's quiz. Now look at their hands. Look at what is being passed between them. That is cash, folded bills, exchanged between a grown man and a child in a middle school classroom. And this was not recorded once. This was not a single incident stumbled upon by accident. This happened again and again and again across 3 full years in this room, on this camera, that nobody ever thought to review. What investigators found when they finally did review it was not what anyone expected, because the man in that polo shirt was not the architect of what was happening. He was not even close to the top of it. He was barely the middle. And what was sitting at the very top of this operation would eventually shake an entire school district down to its foundations and land a man who had received the district's highest leadership award in a federal prison cell for 22 years. You know that feeling when you trust something completely? When you drop your kid off at school, watch them walk through the front doors, and drive away thinking they are fine, they are in good hands. The people inside that building chose this work because they believe in it, and whatever happens behind those walls is going to be structured around your child's well-being and their future. For the families of Ridgecroft, that feeling had been running uninterrupted for 11 years. 11 years of graduation ceremonies and honor roll breakfasts and parent-teacher evenings, and the deep, settled communal confidence that Alcott Preparatory Academy was what it presented itself to be. It was not what it presented itself to be. What happened inside Alcott Preparatory between the fall of 2003 and the spring of 2011 is, on its surface, a story about grades, about academic pressure and parental ambition, and what occurs when the people entrusted with holding the line between achievement and its counterfeit decide that the line is a suggestion rather than a boundary. But peel back one layer, and it becomes a story about something considerably more deliberate. A machine. A carefully designed, quietly maintained machine built by one man who had studied the institution. He ran with the eye of someone looking not at what it could offer its students, but at what it could offer him. And what it could offer him, it turned out, was a great deal. His name was Osterwald Bryn. He had been the principal of Alcott Preparatory for 11 years. He had a framed commendation from the Ridgecroft School District on his office wall naming him Administrator of the Year in 2007. He knew every student by name. He sent handwritten notes to staff on their work anniversaries. He coached the debate team on Tuesday afternoons and stayed late on Fridays, and by every visible metric was exactly the kind of school leader that every school district wants to believe it has produced. He also kept a handwritten ledger in a fireproof safe in his home office that documented $1.4 million in fraudulent transactions spanning 8 years. This is the story of how that ledger was found. Of the science teacher who accidentally discovered everything and made a decision that was wrong in one way and essential in another. Of the detective who followed a financial thread that should have ended at a petty misconduct case and instead unspooled into something that nobody in Ridgecroft was prepared for. And of a principal who had turned a school into an instrument of fraud so quietly, so methodically, and for so long that the community had not just failed to notice. They had, in ways they are still reckoning with, helped to make it possible. Ridgecroft is the kind of town where academic performance is not just valued, it is currency. Not the kind of currency you spend at a store, but the kind that buys something more slippery and more important: status, trajectory, the particular social ease of belonging to a community whose children get into the right universities and go on to the right careers, and come back for reunions and donate to the alumni fund and confirm year after year that the town's investment in its own children has paid the dividends it was supposed to pay. The pressure on students at Alcott Preparatory to perform academically was not occasional or subtle. It was structural. It was in the air. It was in the way parents talked to each other at pickup, in the way GPAs circulated through neighborhood conversations, in the way a B+ in an honors class could carry the weight of a personal failure if you were in the wrong social circle and the right people were paying attention. Osterwald Bryn had grown up in a community very much like Ridgecroft. He understood its psychology the way you understand a language you were raised in, not through analysis, but through instinct. He understood that the families sending their children to Alcott were not, at bottom, primarily concerned with whether those children were learning. They were concerned with outcomes, with trajectories, with the external validation that comes from a transcript and a university acceptance letter, which are related to learning but are not the same thing as learning, and which in a town like Ridgecroft had become, over the years, increasingly legible as ends in themselves. He became principal of Alcott Preparatory in the spring of 2000 at the age of 43, after 12 years in the classroom and 5 as assistant principal at 2 other district schools. By the accounts of everyone who worked with him in those first years at Alcott, he was a capable leader. He ran the school with organizational competence. He managed the politics of the district office without friction. He built relationships with parents that felt genuine. He was, people said, invested in the institution. What happened between 2000 and the fall of 2003, the 3 years between his arrival and his first fraudulent transaction, is not documented in any recovered record and was never fully explained. There is no journal, no correspondence, no testimony from anyone privy to his internal thinking in that transition period. What the investigation established was only the outcome. By September of 2003, Osterwald Bryn had looked at the institution he ran and made a decision about what else it could be used for. The first entry in the ledger, dated September 14, 2003, is brief, a family name. An amount, $15,000, a notation reading, academic package, documentation prepared and filed. That is all. No context, no explanation of how the arrangement had been reached, how the conversation had been initiated, what had been promised in exchange for the payment. Just the transaction, recorded in Bryn's compressed, meticulous script, in a book he had apparently decided from the beginning to maintain with the diligence of a legitimate business record. Because that is how he thought of it, as a business. What Bryn had constructed was a full-service academic fraud operation, and the word full service is doing real work there, because this was not a simple grade-changing scheme of the kind that occasionally surfaces in school corruption cases. A single administrator nudging a failing student to passing, pocketing a payment, hoping nobody looks too carefully. What Bryn built was tiered, sophisticated, and designed to be genuinely transformative for the families who could afford it. The first tier was grade alteration. As principal, Bryn had full administrative access to Alcott's academic record system. He could enter that system at any time, access any student's records, and modify grades without triggering any automatic review flag, because the review flags were built to catch unauthorized access, and Bryn's access was, by definition, authorized. He could change a failing grade to a passing one, lift a C to a B, raise a B to an A, and the adjustment would sit in the system, looking indistinguishable from an administrative correction. He was the administrator. Nobody above him at the school level had the access or the standing to question his entries. The second tier was standardized test documentation, more complex, because standardized testing was administered through external bodies whose records existed outside Alcott's internal systems. Bryn had developed over time a method of producing documents that replicated the formatting and apparent authentication of genuine score reports. They were not sophisticated forgeries in a technical sense, but they were accurate enough in appearance to pass the kind of review that a university admissions office typically conducts, which is a review conducted by people assessing large volumes of applications and not expecting to encounter fabricated documents submitted by an accredited institution. The third tier was letters of recommendation. Bryn wrote them himself. He had spent years working alongside every teacher on his staff, accumulating professional correspondence, absorbing writing styles, developing an understanding of how each individual communicated in formal contexts. He wrote recommendations in the voices of whichever teachers would be most credible for a given student's intended application, using their names, replicating their signatures in careful approximation, and submitting the documents through channels that made them appear to originate from the staff member named. The teachers whose names and signatures appeared on these letters had no knowledge of their existence. In several cases, they had recommended these students not at all, or in much more limited terms, in genuine correspondence of their own. The fourth tier, the one that commanded the highest prices and represented the most comprehensive product, was what Bryn's ledger called the complete historical package. This meant multiple years of retroactively constructed academic records, internally consistent across semesters and subjects, presenting a student as having achieved throughout their time at Alcott what they had never come close to achieving. For families who engaged Bryn's services early enough, whose children were young enough that several years of records could be built prospectively rather than retrofitted, this was not a patch on an existing academic history. It was a replacement for one. A complete, clean, internally coherent academic narrative that would present to any university in the country as the record of a student of consistent achievement and upward trajectory. The price for the complete historical package ranged from $45,000 to $60,000, depending on the scope of modification required and the target universities identified. Lower tiers ran between $8,000 and $20,000. Payment was accepted exclusively in cash or through a wire routing system that passed through a dormant LLC Bryn had incorporated in 2003 and 3 intermediate accounts before landing anywhere that could be connected to him personally. He had built the financial infrastructure before he executed the first transaction. He had thought through the client selection before he made the first approach. He had constructed the operation with the care of someone who had assessed the risks, the leverage points, and the structural guarantees of silence before he collected his first dollar. And the primary structural guarantee of silence was this: the moment a family paid for falsified credentials, they were no longer purely a victim. They were a participant. Their own exposure was bound to the survival of the secret. Their silence was not purchased with additional payments or maintained through threats. It was guaranteed by the logic of their own interests. For 8 years, that logic held almost perfectly. Almost. Callum Featheridge arrived at Alcott Preparatory in September 2007 as the new 7th grade science teacher. He was 29 years old, 2 years out of his teaching certification program, and had taken the position in part because the salary was marginally better than the school he had left, and in part because he was carrying approximately $32,000 in credit card debt that had accumulated through his mid-20s and that he was quietly desperate to resolve. He was, by the accounts of colleagues who later spoke to investigators, a capable if unremarkable teacher. He kept his classroom organized. He graded consistently. He showed up on time and handled his workload without complaint. He was not exceptional. He was, in the institutional sense, reliable. He was also, on a Friday afternoon in the spring of 2009, alone in the administration wing with access to a photocopier and an unfortunate line of sight to a filing cabinet in Osterwald Bryn's office that had been left unlocked. He later described the discovery to investigators with the specificity of a memory that had not faded in the years between the event and the interview. He said he had been waiting for the photocopier to finish a job and had noticed the cabinet drawer not fully closed. He said he had walked over intending to close it. He said he had seen the folder tabs, which bore student names, and had pulled the nearest drawer open further almost without deciding to, the way you do when you notice something that doesn't quite look right, and your hand moves before your brain fully catches up. Inside the folders, he found 2 categories of documents. The first were academic records bearing Alcott's letterhead and what appeared to be the district's authentication markings. Records that looked official, that looked real, but that Featheridge quickly recognized based on his own access to how student records were actually formatted and stored, were not generated by the standard system. The second were handwritten notes in a compressed, even script that listed what appeared to be dollar amounts, dates, and delivery confirmations. He stood at that cabinet for 30 seconds, maybe less. Then he pushed the drawer closed and walked out of the administration wing and drove home and did not sleep that night or the night after. He decided to go to Bryn directly. He convinced himself over that weekend that it was the right thing to do, that confronting the person he had discovered doing something wrong was the appropriate first step, that he would tell Bryn what he knew and give him the chance to stop, and that if Bryn refused, he would take it to the district. He had convinced himself that this was a plan with moral clarity. He walked into Bryn's office on Monday morning with that intention. He walked out with a fundamentally different arrangement. Bryn listened to everything Featheridge said. He did not deny the substance of what Featheridge had seen. He did not raise his voice or make threats or display any of the reactions that Featheridge might have anticipated or prepared for. He simply listened, with a quality of stillness that multiple people who had interactions with Bryn consistently described, and that in context was more unsettling than agitation would have been. And when Featheridge finished, Bryn made him a proposal. The proposal was clear and specific. Featheridge would receive a percentage of revenue from client families whose children were currently enrolled in his classes in exchange for making grade adjustments at the classroom level rather than requiring Bryn to modify grades through the administrative system after the fact. This would reduce the evidentiary footprint of the operation at the records level, since a teacher entering grades at the point of grading was harder to question than an administrator modifying records after their initial entry. Featheridge's percentage would be modest and reliable. In exchange, Bryn guaranteed that in the event the operation ever came under investigation, Featheridge's role would be characterized as peripheral, coerced, and limited, a minor actor caught up in something he had stumbled into rather than an architect of it. Featheridge said yes. He would later tell prosecutors that he said yes because he was frightened, that Bryn's calmness had functioned as its own form of pressure, that refusing had not felt like a genuine option, that he had felt the walls of the room change shape during that conversation in a way he struggled to articulate but was certain he had not imagined. There is something real in that account. There is also the $32,000 in debt that Featheridge's share of the operation resolved within 14 months. The truth of why he agreed in that office on that Monday morning is almost certainly located in the uncomfortable territory between fear and financial relief, which is where most decisions of that kind are made. But here is the thing that Bryn had not anticipated. Featheridge did not trust him, not for a single moment after that conversation. He accepted the arrangement because he had calculated that he had no realistic alternative, but he had simultaneously made a private assessment. If this operation unraveled, Bryn's guarantee of protection was worth exactly nothing. Bryn was the principal. Bryn would have every institutional incentive to position Featheridge as the primary actor and himself as the victim of a subordinate scheme. Featheridge needed insurance, something outside the operation's own documentation, something in a format that Bryn could not control or access or destroy that would support the narrative of Featheridge as a minor, coerced participant when the time came. So he built it himself, quietly, methodically, over the following 2 years. He began collecting small cash amounts from students in his classes, framed as contributions to a voluntary science equipment fund. $20 from one student, $30 from another, $50 from the ones whose parents, based on the school neighborhood and the cars in the pickup line, clearly had it to spare. The amounts were calibrated to be small enough that no parent would question a one-time request for a science classroom fund contribution. He collected the payments in the classroom, after school, after the other students had gone, always in room 14, always in the area covered by the security camera mounted in the upper corner that he had identified on his first day at Alcott and quietly noted as functional and well-positioned. He was deliberately staging transactions on camera. He was creating a visual record in the school's own surveillance system of himself appearing to engage in minor, classroom-level cash collection. Not the main scheme, not the falsified grades, Just the small, explicable, relatively innocent-looking act of a teacher collecting modest amounts from students for a plausible stated purpose. Footage that, when paired with his full testimony about Bryn's operation, would present him to any investigator as exactly what he wanted to appear to be: a low-level participant doing something minor, pulled into something much larger by a powerful administrator he had not been in a position to refuse. He was, with meticulous premeditation, constructing his own defense inside the evidence record of the school he worked for, using the school's own camera. Without telling anyone, it was one of the more extraordinary exercises in calculated self-preservation that any investigator connected to this case had ever encountered in a professional context. It was also the precise thing that caused the entire operation to collapse, because the camera he was relying on for his private insurance was the same camera that an anonymous tip would direct investigators to review, and when they reviewed it, what they saw was not a sophisticated fraudster covering his tracks. It was a teacher accepting cash from students in a classroom, which looked exactly like what it was designed to look like. Simple, explicable, the most visible surface of something much larger, sitting on film, waiting to be found. The tip arrived on a Tuesday morning in early March 2011 through the Ridgecroft School District's anonymous reporting system. The system had been in operation for several years and handled perhaps a dozen complaints per semester, the majority of them minor: scheduling disputes, concerns about staff conduct in specific incidents, occasional allegations about grading fairness. The line existed primarily as a procedural formality. In the years it had been running, it had generated no significant investigations. This tip was different. It was specific, coherent, and appeared to come from someone with direct knowledge of what they were describing. It named Callum Featheridge by name. It named Room 14. It described a teacher accepting cash payments from students on a recurring basis, and it made specific reference to a security camera in Room 14, noting that the footage from that camera had been running for years and should be reviewed. The source of that tip has never been officially confirmed, and the investigation's public documentation does not name the individual who submitted it. Based on the specificity of the information, particularly the reference to the security camera, which was not common knowledge outside the building, investigators concluded that the tip originated from someone with detailed familiarity with Room 14 and its surveillance infrastructure. Their strongest working theory, supported by the broader investigation's reconstruction of events, was that it came from a parent whose child had been withdrawn from Alcott in the preceding 18 months after an attempt to raise concerns about the extra credit fund payments had resulted in a private conversation with Osterwald Bryn. That conversation, by the accounts of the three families who had been subjected to it, had not been threatening in any overtly stated way. Bryn had framed it as pastoral concern. He had expressed worry that a formal complaint might draw district attention to certain financial arrangements in the school's records that, he gently noted, could involve the complaining family in ways they might not anticipate. He had not said, "Be silent or I will expose you." He had said something that functioned identically to that statement while being entirely deniable as a threat, and two of the three families had responded to it by withdrawing their children quietly and staying quiet themselves. The third family eventually had not. The tip landed with Priya Vanthorpe, Alcott's assistant principal, who had been at the school for 6 years and had, by every account from people who knew her professionally, no knowledge of or involvement in Bryn's operation. Vanthorpe read the tip and made a decision that would turn out to be the single most consequential administrative choice in the entire case. She went to the district's internal affairs office rather than to Bryn. Standard protocol for staff conduct complaints was to begin with the school's own leadership. Bryn was her direct superior. Going to him would have been the default move, the path of least resistance, the thing most people in her position would have done without a second thought. She later said that something about the specificity of the complaint had made her instinctively cautious about following the default path. That a complaint this precise, about cash transactions in a specific room on a specific camera, felt like something that needed to go somewhere the school leadership could not immediately access. She could not have articulated at that moment that her caution was warranted. She just felt it was, and she acted on it. That instinct preserved the entire investigation. If the tip had gone to Bryn first, the footage would have been reviewed and likely deleted by the person most motivated to ensure it never became evidence. The case would have ended before it started. The district's internal affairs coordinator, Gretchen Palliser, received the tip from Vanthorpe and requested the Room 14 security footage within 24 hours. She reviewed it over 2 days. The footage showed exactly what the tip had described: a male teacher, identifiable by face and by staff records; students, present after hours; cash, visibly changing hands across multiple recorded sessions spanning 3 years of footage. Palliser referred the matter to the Ridgecroft Police Department on March 8, 2011. The case was assigned to Detective Solène Marchetti. Marchetti had been with Ridgecroft PD for 13 years, the last 7 in criminal investigations. She had worked financial fraud, local government corruption, one case involving a nonprofit organization that had used charitable status as cover for a money laundering operation. She was known internally for being methodical in a way that was almost philosophical. She built cases the way a careful architect builds structures, from the foundation up, checking the integrity of each layer before adding the next. She did not develop a hypothesis and then seek supporting evidence. She started from what was documentably true and built outward from there, which is slower and harder and produces results that are very difficult to dismantle in court. On March 10, 2011, Marchetti pulled Callum Featheridge's financial records, and she found immediately something fundamentally inconsistent. The cash shown changing hands in the Room 14 footage, by Marchetti's conservative estimate, somewhere between $18,000 and $28,000 across the recorded period, was not in Featheridge's bank account, not a dollar of it. His personal finances were exactly what a mid-career teacher at a suburban preparatory school with no unusual assets or income sources would look like. The money visible on that footage had gone somewhere. It was not anywhere connected to Featheridge. She widened the search. Prepaid cards, secondary accounts, any financial instrument registerable in Featheridge's name or traceable through someone in his household. She found nothing connected to Featheridge. But working outward through the prepaid card transaction records in a sideways motion, not looking for Featheridge, but looking for where the money in that general pipeline was actually moving, she identified a pattern of structured deposits into a business account registered to an LLC called Crestwood Advisory Partners. Crestwood Advisory Partners had no website, no listed officers, no filed annual reports, no documentable business activity of any kind, and a registered address at a commercial mail forwarding service in a neighboring county. The LLC had been incorporated in September 2003. Marchetti flagged it and brought in Declan Wolfsberg, a financial crimes specialist from the district attorney's office who had spent 8 years working complex money movement cases before transferring to the DA's unit. Together, over 3 weeks, they traced the money through Crestwood Advisory Partners' account structure. The financial architecture had been constructed to be nearly untraceable. Multiple intermediate accounts, routing through jurisdictions chosen for minimal transparency requirements, transfer timing calibrated to stay below automatic review thresholds. Whoever had built it had understood what they were doing. But nearly untraceable is not fully untraceable. In the LLC's original incorporation filing from September 2003, buried in a supplementary contact sheet that a filing agent had included in error and that had apparently been overlooked in the years since, there was a phone number listed for the LLC's registered representative. The phone number was registered to a landline at an address in Ridgecroft. The address belonged to Osterwald Bryn. Marchetti sat with that information for a full day before she shared it with anyone. She was processing what it meant and what the investigation now required, because the implications were not incremental. This was not a rogue teacher operating alone. This was the principal of Alcott Preparatory Academy, an 11-year institution in one of the district's most established communities, run by a man who had received the district's highest leadership award and was trusted implicitly by hundreds of families, connected by a direct financial thread to an operation that had now, unmistakably, become something far larger than petty misconduct. She went back to the room 14 footage. All of it. The camera had been running for 3 years. Marchetti and a colleague reviewed the complete archive over 4 days, not just the cash exchange segments, but every hour of recorded footage, every after-hours entry, every unusual access pattern, every occasion on which anyone other than Featheridge had been inside room 14 outside of normal school hours. On 14 separate occasions, across those 3 years, the footage showed Osterwald Bryn entering room 14 alone after school hours, staying between 5 and 22 minutes, and leaving. The camera's angle and resolution were insufficient to show precisely what he was doing on those visits, but the pattern was there, documented in timestamps and in the unmistakable face of the man the district had named Administrator of the Year in 2007, present in a 7th grade science classroom, alone, after hours, 14 times, with no documented reason for any of those visits in any school record. On March 28, 2011, Marchetti filed applications for search warrants covering Bryn's school office, his private residence, and his complete personal and business financial records. The application required a presentation to a sitting judge that laid out the full evidentiary chain without alerting Bryn to the investigation's scope. The warrants were granted on the morning of March 29th. Before executing the warrants, Marchetti made a strategic decision to bring Featheridge in for a preliminary interview on March 30th, 2011, 2 days before the residential search. Her reasoning was specific. She wanted to observe his reaction to the financial evidence before he had any indication that Bryn was the primary subject of the investigation, rather than a witness to Featheridge's misconduct. She wanted to see whether Featheridge's response to the question of where the room 14 cash had gone was the response of a man who had been caught, or the response of a man who had been waiting for someone else to catch what he had always known was above him. She presented him with the records showing the flow of cash from room 14 to Crestwood Advisory Partners to Bryn. She said nothing about where the investigation was heading. She put the documents on the table and watched his face. He was frightened for approximately 30 seconds. Then something shifted. He looked, Marchetti later said, like a man who had been holding a door closed for 2 years and had just felt someone on the other side push it open. He asked for an attorney. He received one. 4 days later, on April 3, 2011, he signed a cooperation agreement with the Ridgecroft District Attorney's Office and sat down for the first of 3 recorded interview sessions that together ran 11 hours and 40 minutes. What he described across those sessions was the full architecture of Bryn's operation, the client families, the 4-tier pricing structure, the methodology for falsifying records at each tier, the LLC and the wire routing system, the 3 families who had been threatened into silence when they raised concerns, the specific conversation in Bryn's office in the spring of 2009, Bryn's stillness, the shape of the offer, the moment Featheridge had understood that refusal was not a realistic option. He described Bryn's approach to the operation with a consistency and a precision across all 3 sessions that investigators found credible precisely because nothing in it was self-exculpatory in an obvious way. Featheridge admitted to knowing what the operation was from the moment of the filing cabinet discovery. He admitted to accepting money. He admitted that his credit card debt had been a factor in his decision. He was telling the truth because he needed the cooperation agreement more than he needed a flattering version of his own behavior. The search warrants were executed on April 1, 2011. In Bryn's school office, the search team found encrypted files on his administrative computer. The district's digital forensics unit spent 3 weeks fully processing those files, which contained a secondary set of client records organized by academic year, a template library for the falsified standardized test documents, and a set of draft recommendation letters in various stages of completion, each written in a different voice corresponding to the staff member whose name it was intended to bear. In the home office, they found the safe. Fireproof, steel, bolted to the floor of a closet behind a filing cabinet, requiring both a combination and a physical key. A locksmith worked on it for 40 minutes. When it opened, there was one object inside. The ledger, 163 handwritten pages, 8 years of transactions, family names, student names, grade targets, package tiers, payment amounts and dates, delivery confirmations, brief notations about individual clients, their motivations, their timeline sensitivity, their reliability as payers, their risk profile as potential points of exposure. 47 families across 6 states, revenue totaling by the forensic accountant's calculation $1.4 million. All of it in Osterwald Brinn's own handwriting, all of it documented with the care and precision of someone who considered what they were running to be a well-managed enterprise worth recording properly. Marchetti later said, in a recorded conversation with a legal journalist covering the case, that the ledger was the single most remarkable piece of evidence she had encountered in 13 years of investigative work. Not because of what it proved, though it proved everything, but because of what its existence implied about the person who had created it. You only document something that meticulously if you are proud of it, she said. The ledger was not kept for operational necessity. It was not an internal control measure or a hedge against disputes with clients. It was the record a person keeps when they want to be able to look back at what they built and see it clearly. Osterwald Brinn had been proud of this. He had wanted a record of it. And that, she said, was the most unsettling thing she took away from the entire case. Osterwald Brinn was arrested in the parking lot of Alcott Preparatory Academy on the morning of April 19, 2011. Marchetti had made the location a deliberate choice. Not his home, not the police station, the parking lot of the school, the institution he had run for 11 years, corrupted for 8, and used as the instrument and the cover of an operation that had moved $1.4 million across 4 states, while the community surrounding it dropped off their children every morning and trusted without question that what was inside was what it presented itself to be. He was wearing his lanyard when the officers approached him, the one with the Alcott Preparatory crest on the staff identification badge. He did not resist. He did not appear surprised. He stood in the morning light of the school parking lot with the same quality of composed stillness that every account of him from colleagues, from parents, from the teachers he had managed for years consistently identified as his defining characteristic. He placed his hands behind his back before being asked. He looked at Marchetti and said, in the measured tone of a man who had perhaps been rehearsing this moment for longer than anyone realized, "I would like to contact my attorney." He was processed and transported to the Ridgecroft Police Department for booking. By mid-morning, the school was in crisis management. The district superintendent was on the phone with the school board before 11. Parents received an email before 3 in the afternoon that described an ongoing investigation involving a senior staff member in language so carefully managed that it conveyed almost nothing. A practice that lasted approximately 5 hours before local media had enough of the actual story to report it. The reaction in Ridgecroft in the days that followed was not clean shock. It was messier and more honest than that, because the immediate question every parent who had ever dropped a child at Alcott had to sit with, privately in the uncomfortable quiet of whatever the news reached them, was not just how this could have happened. It was whether the community itself had created the conditions that made it possible. Whether the pressure system, the obsession with outcomes over process, the way academic credentials had become social currency in Ridgecroft over the preceding decade, had built the demand that Osterwald Brinn had supplied. Whether they had wanted something like this to exist and had simply preferred not to look at it. That question does not have a comfortable answer. The Room 14 security footage, the footage that Callum Featheridge had deliberately staged across 2 years as his personal insurance policy, the footage that had generated the anonymous tip that had started the entire investigation, was formally entered into the evidentiary record of the case in early April 2011, following Featheridge's cooperation agreement. Marchetti and the prosecution team had returned to it multiple times during the investigation, and each review added context as their understanding of the full operation's structure developed. In its initial review, the footage had appeared to document a teacher exploiting students for cash. By the time of its submission as evidence, the understanding was entirely different. It showed a man who had been complicit in a major fraud operation and had simultaneously, with premeditation, used the school's own surveillance infrastructure to create a visual record that would support his cooperation narrative if the operation collapsed. The cash exchanges visible in room 14 were not evidence of Featheridge's primary crime. They were evidence of his attempt to limit the consequences of it. He had used the camera that would expose him as the instrument of his own partial defense. The prosecution's evidentiary presentation at trial was built around 4 anchors: the room 14 footage establishing the cash operation and Brin's after-hours access, the financial records tracing the money through Crestwood Advisory Partners to Brin's accounts, Featheridge's full cooperation testimony, delivered across 3 sessions and consistent throughout, and the ledger, which the prosecution saved for last. The teacher whose name and signature had been forged on letters of recommendation, Tamsin Okafor, Alcott's head of English, who had taught at the school for 9 years, and who had, in several cases, recommended these students in genuinely warm but accurately measured terms in her own authentic letters, unaware that a parallel set of letters bearing her name in Brin's hand had simultaneously been submitted to the same universities, provided victim impact testimony that multiple journalists covering the trial later described as the most affecting moment of the proceedings. She spoke not about financial loss or professional damage. She spoke about what it felt like to discover that her professional voice, her considered, carefully worded expression of her genuine assessment of her students, had been replaced, without her knowledge, by someone else's words in her name. She said she had felt, reading Brin's versions of her letters in the discovery documents, like a stranger had been speaking for her for years, in rooms she had never entered. Brin's defense team challenged the search warrant on Fourth Amendment grounds, arguing that the financial investigation had exceeded its initial scope in a way that tainted the evidence derived from it. The suppression motion was denied. The ledger was admitted in full. The defense then pivoted to a mitigation argument that Brin had acted in response to genuine need from families under impossible pressure, that he had been providing a service that the educational system's own structural failures had created demand for, and that his actions, while illegal, were not predatory in the conventional sense because all parties had entered into the arrangements knowingly. The argument had a certain coherence. It was dismantled methodically and completely by the ledger, because the ledger did not read like the record of an educator responding compassionately to desperate families. It read like a business owner tracking inventory, revenue, client risk profiles, and delivery timelines. The clinical precision of the entries, the notations about individual families' risk tolerance, the assessments of which clients were reliable payers and which posed elevated exposure risk, did not describe a man acting out of compassion for struggling students. It described a man who had identified a market, built a product, and managed his client base with the detachment of someone who had never confused his customers with his cause. Brin took the stand in his own defense on the 4th day of trial testimony. He was, by every account from observers in the courtroom, exactly what he had always presented as: composed, articulate, and projecting the professional authority of a man who had spent 11 years being the person in the room that others deferred to. He maintained his composure through the prosecution's cross-examination in a way that some observers described as impressive and others described as chilling, depending on their disposition toward him. The jury deliberated for 2 days and 3 hours. On the afternoon of January 14, 2012, they returned to the courtroom and the forewoman stood and read the verdict: guilty, on every count. The sentencing hearing for Osterwald Brin was held on March 9, 2012, almost exactly 1 year after the anonymous tip had arrived in the district's reporting system. The hearing lasted 4.5 hours. 14 people addressed the court: former students, current staff, parents of students who had earned their records legitimately and who felt in a way they struggled to articulate but clearly felt deeply that those records had been devalued by the existence of what Brin had been selling. Tamsin Okafor spoke again, briefly, and said only that she hoped the institution would recover what it had been before she had worked there and had believed it to be while she was working there. She sat down without looking at Brin. Brin was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. He showed no visible reaction. He was led from the courtroom still carrying himself with the composed bearing that had served him for 11 years as the most effective instrument of his authority and his concealment. Callum Featheridge, under the terms of his cooperation agreement, received a sentence of 18 months in a minimum security facility, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and a permanent bar from employment in any educational institution at any level. He was released in the fall of 2013. He has given no public statements about the case and is not known to have sought any public profile in the years since his release. 47 civil suits were filed against Bryn personally and against the Ridgecroft School District by a combination of affected parties, including families whose children had been displaced from legitimate university acceptances by students whose records Bryn had falsified, teachers whose professional identities had been used without consent, and several of the client families themselves who pursued civil claims against Bryn for fraud on the grounds that the product he had sold them was a fraudulent misrepresentation, even within the context of a fraudulent arrangement. Those suits wound through the civil courts over the following 4 years, settling or reaching judgment on a case-by-case basis. The 47 universities that had received applications built on Bryn's falsified records were notified by the district attorney's office beginning in the spring of 2012. Each institution conducted its own internal review. The outcomes varied by university, by the individual circumstances of the student involved, and by the policies each institution applied to cases of fraudulent admission. Several students were expelled. Several were permitted to continue on academic probation with the determination that their subsequent performance demonstrated sufficient genuine capability to justify continued enrollment. A small number of students voluntarily withdrew before their cases were formally reviewed. None of the outcomes were clean. All of them involved young people who had not made the decision that had put them in that position, being asked to bear consequences for a choice their parents had made. The 3 families whom Bryn had threatened into silence when they attempted to raise concerns about the extra credit fund approached calmly, warned implicitly, made to understand that their silence was the cost of their continued protection from their own exposure, were treated as victims throughout the investigation and prosecution. Their cooperation with investigators was documented in the final case record as a material factor in the successful prosecution. 2 of those families have spoken publicly about their experiences in the years since the trial. 1 has not. Priya Vanthorpe was appointed interim principal of Alcott Preparatory Academy immediately following Bryn's arrest and was confirmed in the position permanently 6 months later. She served as principal for 9 years. Staff who worked under her leadership during that period consistently described her administration as one characterized by transparency, by a deliberate open-door policy for concerns of any kind, and by an insistence on documented decision-making processes for any action touching student records. She was, multiple teachers noted, the first person in the principal's office who actively encouraged staff to escalate concerns outside the school if they felt internal channels were insufficient. She did not need to explain why that mattered. Everyone already knew. The Ridgecroft School District implemented structural reforms beginning in the fall of 2012. External academic records audits conducted annually by reviewers with no institutional connection to individual schools were mandated across the district. A co-authorization requirement for any administrative modification to student records was introduced, requiring a second administrator's approval for any change at the records level. The anonymous reporting system was redesigned so that tips involving a school's own leadership were automatically routed to the district attorney's office rather than to internal affairs. A policy was adopted requiring that all letters of recommendation submitted under a teacher's name be acknowledged in writing by that teacher before submission, a reform so basic that its absence from existing policy, in retrospect, was almost incomprehensible. The final reform was named the Vanthorpe Protocol, after the assistant principal whose decision to take the March 2011 tip outside the school rather than to Bryn had made everything that followed possible. Declan Wolfsberg, the financial crimes specialist who spent 3 weeks tracing the Crestwood Advisory Partners money trail, was commended by the district attorney's office for the quality of the financial forensics work in the case. He remained with the DA's Financial Crimes Unit for 6 more years before moving to a federal investigative role. Selene Marchetti made detective sergeant in 2014. She has worked 3 additional significant fraud cases since the Bryn investigation. She has said, in the one recorded conversation about the case she has given, that it changed how she thinks about institutional trust, not by making her cynical about it, but by making her more precise about what trust requires. Trust is not passive, she said. It requires structures. It requires checks. It requires people who are willing to ask the uncomfortable question when something doesn't quite look right, even when asking it is the harder path. Priya Vanthorpe asked the uncomfortable question. That's why we caught him. Osterwald Bryn was charged with wire fraud across 12 counts, mail fraud across 9 counts, conspiracy to commit academic credential fraud, coercion of witnesses, and operating a criminal enterprise. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for the first 15 years. The students at Alcott Preparatory who earned their grades without any arrangement, who sat in Callum Featheridge's science class and worked through the tests on their own and received the marks they had actually achieved. Those students were never named in any filing, never mentioned in any proceeding, never recognized in any public accounting of what had happened to the institution they attended. They were students who went to school. They did the work. They deserved a place where the work meant what it was supposed to mean. For 8 years, while a man in a corner office kept a ledger of everything he was selling and everyone he was selling it to, those students did not have that. They had an institution that was using their legitimate presence as the cover story for its own corruption. They deserve better than that. They deserve the school that Alcott Preparatory Academy said it was.